Lyra stood at the edge of the crystal cliffs, watching the three massive ships descend through the clouds like metal birds falling from the sky. Her silver hair caught the light of the twin suns, and her green eyes tracked every movement of the human vessels. Beside her, Storm shifted his weight, his large dragon body creating small tremors in the ground beneath them. Ember, the smaller golden dragon, pressed against her leg, releasing nervous energy through little wisps of smoke from her nostrils. The elven prophecies had spoken of this day for centuries. The humans were coming to Kalthara, and the Council of Elders had spent weeks discussing whether this meant salvation or destruction. Lyra had spent those weeks doing something very different. She had studied the human broadcasts that occasionally reached their world through old transmitters, hidden in the ruins of the ancient civilization. While her people prepared for war, she had prepared for peace. Her grandmother, Elder Mira, had called her foolish just that morning. The old elf had gripped Lyra's shoulders with surprising strength and looked directly into her eyes. Mira said that humans were destroyers, that they consumed worlds like locusts consuming crops, that they left nothing but ash and sorrow in their wake. Lyra had listened respectfully, as a young elf should to an elder, but she had not believed. She could not believe it because everything she had learned from the broadcasts told a different story. 3 seasons ago, Lyra had discovered the ancient transmission tower hidden beneath the fallen temples in the Valley of Echoes. No other elf had ventured there for generations, afraid of the old magic that still lingered in those places. But Lyra had never been afraid of the ancient things. She had descended into the darkness with only Storm's fire to light her way, and she had found wonders. The tower still worked. The systems still powered themselves through methods she did not fully understand, but it did not matter. What mattered was that the tower received broadcasts from human space stations, and Lyra had taught herself to listen. The broadcasts showed her human families sitting around tables together, sharing food. They showed human children being taught in schools. They showed human artists creating beautiful things. They showed human workers building structures that reached toward the sky. Yes, she had also seen human soldiers and human weapons, but she had seen something else too. She had seen humans helping each other. She had seen them mourning their dead with respect. She had seen them showing kindness to animals and to strangers. This was not what the prophecies described. This was not what her grandmother feared. Storm rumbled beneath his breath, a sound like distant thunder. Through their bond, Lyra felt his anxiety. He was a dragon, a creature of intuition and primal feeling. And everything about the arrival of the human ships made his instincts scream danger. She placed her hand on his scaled neck and sent him calm through the connection they shared. Not everything that feels dangerous is evil, she tried to communicate to him. Sometimes fear comes from not understanding. The ship settled on the ground in the Valley of New Beginnings, exactly where the scouts had predicted they would land. Lyra had studied the geography of that valley extensively. It had water from the river, open space for construction, natural protection from the mountain ridges, and it was far enough from the main elven settlements that panic would not immediately spread. Whoever commanded these human ships knew how to choose a location. That told her they were thinking clearly, not attacking blindly. A messenger bird arrived at the Crystal Cliffs before sunset, sent from the royal palace. The Council of Elders demanded Lyra's presence immediately. The message was polite but urgent. The king himself wanted to speak with her. Lyra was not surprised. Everyone knew that she had been studying human languages and culture. Everyone also knew that the elders disapproved. But she was not a member of the council, and she had broken no laws. She had only used her own time and resources to satisfy her own curiosity. She left Storm and Ember in the hidden cave where they rested during the day, a place no hunter would ever find. The 3 of them had bonded when Lyra was only 7 years old. Storm had been an egg abandoned after his mother was killed by a rock slide. Lyra had found him and kept him warm through that cold season. Ember had come into her life 2 years later, a small injured dragon that she had nursed back to health. The bond between them was deeper than words. They were family in a way that went beyond blood. The journey to the palace took 4 hours on foot through the singing forest, so called because the wind through the trees created sounds like voices speaking in low tones. Lyra took her time, thinking about what she would say to the king. Should she tell him about the broadcasts? Should she try to convince him that the humans might be peaceful? Or should she simply listen to what he had to say and answer his questions honestly? The palace rose up before her as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. White stone carved from the mountain centuries ago, it stood as a monument to elven permanence and strength. Guards in formal armor stood at every entrance, their faces showing the strain of these tense times. They recognized Lyra and let her pass without question. She was known to them, the young scholar who spent her days in the archives and her nights watching the stars. King Aldrich sat on his throne in the great hall, but he descended to greet her in a more casual chamber. The king was tall even for an elf, with long dark hair and eyes that seemed to see through people. He studied Lyra carefully as she entered, making her feel exposed and examined. She bowed respectfully, not taking her eyes off the ground until he gestured for her to rise. The king asked her directly what she knew about the humans. He asked if she had been attempting to communicate with them. He asked if she believed the stories that claimed humans could be trusted. Lyra answered each question with the truth. She told him about the broadcast and what they had taught her. She explained her theory that humans were not so different from elves, that they had families and feelings and desires for peace just as her people did. She said that she believed they should try to communicate before assuming the worst. King Aldrich listened without interrupting. When Lyra finished speaking, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he told her something that shocked her. He said that the human ships had sent a communications signal when they landed. They had requested a meeting with any representative of the indigenous population. The Council of Elders had argued about how to respond. Some wanted to attack immediately, some wanted to hide. But the king had been waiting for someone to step forward and advocate for a different approach. He asked Lyra if she would be willing to go to the human settlement. He wanted her to meet with their leaders and assess whether they came in peace or in conquest. This was not an order, he said. It was a choice. If she agreed, she would be putting herself in danger. The humans might capture her or harm her, but if she refused, the elves would act based on fear alone, and that might lead to war. Lyra did not hesitate. She said yes. The king nodded slowly, as if he had expected nothing less. He told her that a small group of guards would accompany her to the edge of the human settlement, but she would have to go forward to meet them alone. It would be too threatening to arrive with armed elves. He gave her a small crystal that contained the formal greetings of the elven kingdom, something that could be presented as a sign of peaceful intent. As Lyra left the palace, the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red. She thought about Storm and Ember waiting in their hidden cave. She thought about her grandmother's warnings and the king's faith in her judgment. She thought about all those broadcasts showing human families and human kindness. Tomorrow she would discover whether her study and her hope had any basis in reality. Tomorrow she would meet the humans face to face and learn if peace was truly possible. That night she barely slept. She lay beside Storm in the cave, her hand resting on his warm scales, and she prayed to the ancient spirits of Calthera that she was making the right choice. Storm breathed softly beside her, his massive body providing comfort through proximity. Ember curled up around them both, smaller and more delicate but equally protective. In the darkness, with her dragons close, Lyra found the courage she would need for what was coming. The morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of morning where everything felt possible and terrifying at the same time. Lyra woke before dawn and began preparing herself for the journey to the human settlement. She dressed in clothes that would not hinder her movement, practical garments in shades of green and brown that would help her blend with the forest as she traveled. She fastened her hair back carefully and took only a small pack with water and food for the journey. Storm sensed her purpose and became restless. The large dragon paced around the cave, his tail sweeping in agitated arcs. Through their bond, Lyra felt his strong desire to accompany her. He did not like the idea of her going anywhere without him, especially to meet unknown humans. Ember felt the same way, though she expressed it more quietly, staying close to Lyra's side as if proximity could somehow protect her. Lyra knelt down between them and pressed her forehead to Storm's scaled head. She spoke to him in the language that all elves understood, the language of feeling and thought that was older than words. She told him that this was something she needed to do alone. She explained that bringing dragons to the human settlement would appear threatening, even though she knew their hearts were good. She promised that she would not let anything happen to herself. She promised that she would come back to them. Storm was not happy about this, but he understood. Dragons were creatures of honor and intuition, and Storm knew that Lyra was right. Ember nuzzled against Lyra's neck one final time, and then Lyra walked out of the cave into the pale light of early morning. The guards were waiting for her at the meeting point, 6 armored elves on horseback. They did not speak much as they guided her through the forest and across the grasslands that separated the elven territories from the Valley of New Beginnings. Their faces showed concern and doubt. Most of them believed she was walking to her death. Lyra chose not to argue with them. She simply rode forward with her head held high and her heart steady. As they approached the edge of the valley, the human settlement came into view. The ships had been arranged in a circle, creating a protected space in the center. Structures were already being constructed around them, temporary shelters and work areas. Humans in suits moved between the buildings, carrying equipment and supplies. A wall of scanned and analyzed material surrounded the perimeter, but it was not a weapons installation. It looked more like a defensive measure than an aggressive one. The elven guard stopped at a designated point a good distance from the human settlement. Their leader, a stern elf named Theron, instructed Lyra to proceed on foot from here. He told her that if she was not back within one full day, they would assume she was being held against her will, and they would storm the settlement with force. Lyra nodded and accepted this condition. She understood the need for precaution. Taking a deep breath, Lyra walked forward alone across the grassland. As she approached the human perimeter, she could see them noticing her. They pointed and shouted to each other. Some of them began running, but she kept her pace steady and peaceful. She raised her empty hands to show she carried no weapons. When she reached the boundary of the settlement, armed humans had formed a defensive line, their weapons raised but not yet aimed directly at her. A human woman stepped forward from the group. She was tall and dark-skinned, with hair cut close to her head and eyes that assessed Lyra with sharp intelligence. She wore a uniform that suggested authority and command. Her name was Captain Marina Rivera, and Lyra recognized her from the broadcasts. She had been a military commander on one of the human worlds. That was why she seemed so calm about an armed elf walking into her settlement. Rivera raised her hand to signal her soldiers to lower their weapons. Then she approached Lyra with careful, deliberate steps. They stood facing each other, two representatives of different worlds and different peoples, separated only by a few feet of distance and centuries of unknowing. Rivera spoke in the human trade language, assuming that Lyra would not understand. But Lyra did understand. She had spent so many hours listening to the broadcasts that she had learned to recognize the language, though she had never had a chance to speak it aloud before. She opened her mouth and responded in that same language, her accent strange but her words clear. She told Rivera that she came from the Elven Kingdom with peaceful intentions. She told her that the king had sent her to determine whether the humans came in peace or in war. She told her that she wished to learn whether the two peoples could find a way to coexist on Calthera. Rivera's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. She invited Lyra to come inside the settlement where they could talk more privately. Lyra agreed, and they walked together through the organized chaos of the human camp. Other humans stared at her as she passed, but Rivera's presence seemed to provide reassurance. The captain was clearly someone her people respected and followed. They entered one of the larger structures, a temporary command center, and Rivera offered Lyra a seat. She provided water and food, treating her guest with genuine hospitality. Then she began asking careful questions about the Elven Kingdom, about their history on Calthera, about their intentions toward the humans. Lyra answered each question thoughtfully. She explained that the elves had lived on this world for thousands of years in peace with nature. She told Rivera about the prophecies that had caused her people to fear human arrival. She spoke about the attempts she had made to learn about human culture and character. She told the captain that she had come to believe that humans were not the destroyers her people feared, but rather people seeking a home, just as the elves had sought a home long ago. Rivera listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification. Then she told Lyra her own story. She explained that humans had nearly destroyed their own world through greed and conflict. Now they were spreading out into the galaxy, seeking to do better, seeking to find worlds where they could build new civilizations based on the lessons they had learned. She said that Calthera had been chosen because it appeared uninhabited. The discovery of the elven civilization changed everything, but it did not change their fundamental desire for peace. The captain told Lyra that the human leadership back on the homeworlds had given specific instructions about first contact with indigenous species. They were to approach with respect and a genuine desire for cooperation. They were forbidden from taking resources by force or establishing control over existing populations. These were not perfect guidelines, but they represented genuine attempts to move away from the destructive patterns of human history. Over the next several hours, Lyra and Rivera talked about many things. They discussed the geography of Calthera and the dangers that both species would face on this world. They talked about the creatures that emerged from the outer wastes each year, dangerous predators that attacked anything living. They exchanged information about their respective peoples and their technologies. By the time the sun began to set, Lyra was beginning to feel that her instincts had been correct. Rivera was not a deceiver or a destroyer. She was a person of honor, who genuinely wanted to establish peaceful relations with the elven civilization. But trust could not be built in a single day. That would take time and repeated demonstrations of good faith. Before Lyra left to return to the elven guards, Rivera made a proposal. She asked if the humans could send a small delegation to meet with the elven king. She suggested that it would be better if the leadership of both peoples could talk directly, rather than relying on reports from a single meeting. Lyra said she would speak to the king about this possibility. The elven guards were surprised and relieved when Lyra walked back across the grassland alive and unharmed. As they rode back toward the elven territories, Lyra thought about everything she had learned. She thought about the possibilities that had opened up before them. She thought about Storm and Ember waiting for her in their cave, and how she would tell them that she had taken a step toward peace. When she finally reached the hidden cave late that night, her dragons welcomed her with such enthusiasm and joy that all her doubts fell away. She knew that she had made the right choice. She knew that peace was possible, and she knew that tomorrow everything would begin to change. King Aldrich listened to Lyra's report with careful attention, asking questions but rarely interrupting. The throne room was empty except for the two of them and a few trusted advisors who maintained their distance. The king sat forward slightly as Lyra described her conversation with Captain Rivera, her assessment of the human commander, and the proposal for a direct meeting between leadership. When Lyra finished speaking, the king rose from his throne and walked to the great windows that overlooked the elven lands. For a long time he said nothing. The silence stretched out, filled with the weight of decisions that would affect thousands of people. Finally he turned back to face her. The king told Lyra that her instincts appeared to be sound, but that intuition alone was not enough for such important decisions. He said that he would call a full council meeting of all the elven leadership. They would hear Lyra's report directly. They would debate the matter thoroughly, and then they would decide whether to invite the human delegation to the palace. This process took 3 days. The council chambers filled with elders, nobles, and war leaders. Some argued passionately for an immediate military strike against the human settlement. They said that Lyra had been deceived, that humans were masters of deception and manipulation. Others listened to her report with thoughtful consideration. They asked detailed questions about the technology the humans possessed, their apparent intentions, and their leaders. The debate was intense and sometimes angry, but it remained civil. During those 3 days, Lyra stayed mostly alone in her small chamber in the palace. She thought about Storm and Ember, wondering how they were managing without her constant presence. She wondered if she had done the right thing by revealing her knowledge of the broadcast to the council. Several of the elders had questioned her about this, suggesting that it was improper for a single individual to conduct her own diplomatic investigations without authorization. On the evening of the 3rd day, King Aldrich summoned her to his private chambers. He told her that the council had voted, though not unanimously. They had decided to invite a small human delegation to the palace for formal talks. The humans would be allowed to bring no more than 5 representatives, and they would be received in the council chambers under careful observation. This was a significant step, though it fell short of a full alliance. The king also told Lyra something else that surprised her. He said that the council had recognized her unique value in this situation. They were asking if she would be willing to serve as a special advisor during the negotiations. They wanted her to help ensure that nothing was lost in translation between the two species, both literally and culturally. The position would require her to leave her studies temporarily and devote herself fully to this work. Lyra accepted immediately. She was honored by the trust the council had placed in her, even if some of the elders had voted against the entire enterprise. The next morning, A small group of elven riders set out for the human settlement to deliver the invitation. Lyra traveled with them this time, knowing that she could help explain the significance of what was being offered. When they arrived at the settlement, Captain Rivera welcomed them with the kind of warmth that suggested genuine relief and happiness. She accepted the invitation on behalf of the humans and immediately began making preparations for the delegation that would travel to the palace. That night, Lyra finally returned to Storm and Ember in their hidden cave. She had not been able to visit them for 3 days, and the reunion was joyful. Storm's rumbling almost seemed like laughter as he pressed his massive head against her. Ember flew in excited circles around them both. Lyra lay between them and told them everything that had happened. Through the bond they shared, she let them feel her emotions and her hopes for the future. The day of the human delegation's arrival at the palace was marked by tension and careful preparation. The council chambers had been arranged formally, with the king on his throne and the elven leaders arranged around the room. Guards stood at every entrance. There was an almost overwhelming sense of anticipation and fear. When the human delegation entered, all eyes fixed upon them. Captain Rivera led the group, accompanied by 3 other military officers and 1 civilian official who represented human government authority. They moved carefully and respectfully, aware that they were being assessed by every person in the room. The king rose to greet them, a gesture of honor and welcome. He welcomed them to the palace and to the Elven Kingdom. He told them that the elves had lived on Calthera in peace for millennia, and that his people hoped to continue this peace with the newcomers to their world. Rivera responded with equal formality. She thanked the king for receiving the human delegation. She stated that the human government had no intention of displacing or harming the elven civilization. She expressed the desire for trade, mutual defense agreements, and the sharing of knowledge between the 2 peoples. Over the next several hours, the 2 delegations discussed the specifics of potential cooperation. They talked about establishing formal trade routes. They discussed the threat posed by the creatures from the outer wastes and the possibility of coordinating defenses. They explored the idea of scientific and cultural exchange programs. Lyra observed everything carefully, occasionally stepping forward to clarify a point or explain a cultural reference that seemed to be creating confusion. She noticed that Rivera was particularly skilled at reading the emotional temperature in the room and adjusting her approach accordingly. When the elders seemed skeptical, Rivera provided specific examples and demonstrated genuine respect for elven concerns. One moment stood out as particularly important. An elder named Thorn challenged Rivera about human intentions, suggesting that the captain was being dishonest. He said that humans always exploited indigenous populations in the end. Rivera did not become defensive or angry. Instead, she acknowledged that humans had a troubled history. She admitted that her people had made terrible mistakes, but she insisted that they were committed to moving forward differently. She said that the humans would welcome oversight and accountability measures if that would help build trust with the Elven Kingdom. This honest acknowledgement seemed to shift something in the council. Several elders who had been skeptical began to soften their positions. King Aldrich seemed particularly moved by Rivera's willingness to admit human failings without making excuses. By the end of the day, tentative agreements had been reached. A formal treaty would be drafted over the next several weeks. In the meantime, small teams of humans and elves would begin working together on immediate practical matters, particularly in preparing for the approaching season when the creatures from the outer wastes would emerge. As the sun set and the delegation prepared to leave the palace, Captain Rivera approached Lyra privately. The captain thanked her for making this all possible. She said that without Lyra's courage and her genuine belief that peace was achievable, none of this would have happened. Rivera promised that the humans would honor the trust that was being extended to them. Lyra walked the captain to the entrance of the palace, and as they stepped into the cool evening air, Storm appeared overhead in the darkening sky. The dragon descended and landed gracefully beside them. Rivera, instead of showing fear, smiled with genuine delight. She reached out and placed her hand on Storm's scaled neck, and the dragon accepted the touch with calm acceptance. In that moment, Lyra understood that the future of Calthera had just fundamentally changed. The dragons had accepted the humans had respected the elves, and 2 individuals who came from completely different worlds had found common ground. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Calthera would face them as a world united rather than divided. The formal treaty was completed within 3 weeks, with input from elven scholars, human diplomats, and numerous advisors from both sides. Lyra was involved in every stage of the process, helping to ensure that the language was clear and that both sides truly understood what they were agreeing to. The document guaranteed mutual respect, guaranteed that neither side would encroach on the other's territory without permission, and established frameworks for trade and military cooperation. But more important than the treaty itself were the practical collaborations that began immediately. Teams of humans and elves started working together before the treaty was even finalized. Human engineers worked with elven architects to design defensive structures that could withstand the creatures from the outer wastes. Elven scouts shared their knowledge of the landscape with human strategic planners. Human doctors began teaching elves about human medicine while learning about elven healing practices that had been developed over thousands of years. Lyra found herself at the center of many of these collaborations. She had become something more than just a translator. She was a bridge between two worlds, someone who genuinely understood both perspectives and could help each side recognize the value and reasoning behind the other side's approach. During this time, Storm and Ember became increasingly important to the growing alliance. Lyra began bringing them to the meetings between human and elven teams. At first, the humans were nervous and excited around the dragons. But as they spent time with Storm and Ember, they realized that the dragons were intelligent, gentle, and genuinely interested in the work being done. Storm would sometimes place his large head over a map to look at it more carefully, as if he understood the strategic implications of what was being planned. A human engineer named Dr. Patricia Williams became particularly fascinated by the dragons. She began spending extra time with Storm and Ember, watching how they moved and how they responded to different situations. One day she approached Lyra with an idea. She asked if it would be possible for humans and elves to ride on dragons, similar to how Lyra rode Storm. She suggested that dragon cavalry could be extremely valuable for rapid deployment and reconnaissance missions. Lyra was initially uncertain about this idea. She had always felt that Storm and Ember should be treated as friends and partners, not as military assets. But when she discussed the idea with Storm through their bond, she felt something surprising. Storm seemed interested and even eager about the prospect. Through their connection, he showed her his sense of purpose and his desire to be part of this work that Lyra was doing. Over the following weeks, a training program was established. Lyra selected 5 human volunteers and 5 elven volunteers to begin learning how to ride the dragon safely. Storm and Ember were patient teachers, though Lyra could feel their amusement at times when their new riders were nervous or uncertain. Watching humans and elves working together to accomplish this seemed like the most perfect symbol of what the alliance was meant to be. 3 months after the treaty was signed, the creatures began emerging from the outer wastes. They came exactly as they did every year at this season. The creatures were monstrous things, large predators with chitinous bodies and too many teeth. They attacked anything that seemed to have life in it, whether that life was plant or animal or sapient being. The elves had survived against these creatures for thousands of years through superior knowledge and careful strategy, but now they would not have to face them alone. The first major encounter took place at the border between elven and human territories. A scouting party reported hundreds of the creatures moving toward the settlements. This was an opportunity to test whether the military cooperation was real or just words written on paper. Lyra rode Storm into battle for the first time since the humans had arrived. Beside her, human and elven riders rode on dragons that had been specifically trained to carry warriors. Human soldiers and elven warriors advanced on the ground, working in coordinated formations that they had practiced extensively. The creatures came forward in a massive wave, their alien forms moving with terrible purpose. The battle was nothing like Lyra had imagined or wanted. It was loud and chaotic and horrifying, but it was also inspiring in ways she had not expected. She saw humans and elves standing side by side, protecting each other, fighting together against a common enemy. When an elven warrior stumbled and fell, a human soldier immediately moved to cover him and help him back to his feet. When a human was surrounded by creatures, a team of elves rushed in to protect him. Storm flew above the battle, using his fire to burn the approaching creatures. The heat from dragon fire was devastating to these creatures. They had no defense against such intense heat. One by one they fell back, realizing that this battlefield now held weapons they could not overcome. The creatures retreated toward the outer wastes, and the humans and elves pursued them, driving them back completely. By the end of the day, the creature forces had been routed. The combined alliance had lost 20 warriors, a painful number but far fewer than either side would have lost fighting alone. As Lyra landed Storm in a clearing and dismounted, she found herself surrounded by both human and elven soldiers approaching her. They wanted to touch Storm and thank him. They wanted to celebrate the victory with everyone who had made it possible. Captain Rivera approached Lyra and embraced her, a gesture of affection that transcended species and origin. Rivera told her that this victory was only possible because of Lyra's belief that peace was achievable and her willingness to risk everything to make it happen. Over the following weeks, more battles occurred as creatures continued to emerge. Each time the humans and elves worked together more effectively than before. They learned each other's tactics and strategies. They developed new techniques that combined human technology with elven knowledge. They began to see each other not as different species working together out of necessity, but as genuine allies with deep respect for one another. Lyra noticed something interesting happening in the settlements. Humans and elves began socializing outside of military and diplomatic contexts. They shared meals together. Human children played with elf children. They told each other stories of their respective worlds. A few romantic relationships even began to form between humans and elves, though Lyra was not sure if such relationships would ever be practical or permanent. What mattered was that the barriers were breaking down. 2 months after the first battle, King Aldrich and the human command leadership met to discuss what would happen when the creature season ended. The human leaders proposed something significant. They suggested that humans and elves should begin establishing permanent settlements together, integrated communities where the two species lived side by side. They proposed that joint governance structures be created so that both humans and elves had equal say in decisions affecting their shared territories. The proposal was bold and not without risk. Many elders were nervous about such deep integration, but King Aldrich, perhaps influenced by Lyra's persistent belief in the best of both peoples, agreed to the proposal. Pilot programs would begin immediately in 3 locations. Humans and elves would work together to build new communities from scratch, designing them specifically to accommodate both species and both cultures. Lyra was asked to oversee the first of these integrated settlements. It would be built in the Valley of New Beginnings, the same place where the human ships had first landed. It would represent the fulfillment of everything Lyra had dreamed about since she first heard those human broadcasts in the ancient tower, as she stood, with Storm and Ember looking over the valley where construction was beginning. Lyra allowed herself to feel genuine hope. The future was no longer uncertain and frightening. It was becoming something beautiful, something worth all the risk and effort she had invested. 1 year had passed since Lyra walked into the human settlement as an uncertain bridge between 2 worlds. The Valley of New Beginnings had transformed into something that neither humans nor elves could have imagined building alone. White stone structures that echoed elven architecture stood side by side, with human metal and glass buildings. Gardens displayed both elven and human plants. The settlement was beautiful not because it was perfect, but because it represented genuine cooperation and mutual respect. Lyra stood on a platform overlooking the valley, with Storm beside her and Ember perched on a stone nearby. The settlement below was alive with activity. Human children played with elf children in the central plaza. Workers of both species moved between construction sites, continuing the expansion of the integrated community. In the distance, dragon riders patrolled the skies, both human and elf mounted on trained dragons. The settlement had a name now. The people who lived there had voted on it together, with humans and elves participating equally in the decision. They called it Harmony's Rest, a place where 2 peoples had come together and discovered that difference did not have to mean conflict. It was both a practical settlement and a symbol of what could be achieved when fear was replaced with curiosity and courage. King Aldrich had visited Harmony's Rest several months ago, and he had been impressed by what was being accomplished. He had announced that the model was so successful that 5 more integrated settlements would be established over the following years. Lyra had been asked to oversee the planning for the second settlement, though she would base herself in Harmony's Rest. Humans and elves who had worked in the first settlement were now spreading out to help establish the new communities, carrying their experience and their commitment to genuine integration. Captain Rivera had been promoted to overall commander of joint human and elven military operations. She worked alongside an elven general named Thorn, who had once been skeptical of the humans but had been converted to the cause by witnessing their capabilities and their integrity. Together, Rivera and Thorn had created a defense strategy that protected Calthera far more effectively than either species could have done alone. The creature season this year had been less severe than the previous one, and the Alliance had routed the attackers with minimal losses. There was a growing confidence that eventually the creatures would become less of a threat as the humans and elves learned more about them and developed more effective countermeasures. One of the most unexpected developments had been the scientific collaboration. Human researchers and elven scholars had begun working together to understand Calthera's history and potential future. They had discovered evidence suggesting that an ancient civilization had once thrived on this world, far more advanced than anything humans or elves had currently achieved. Lyra found herself involved in these explorations as well, translating not just languages but concepts and perspectives. Dr. Patricia Williams, the human engineer who had been fascinated by the dragons, had made an important breakthrough. She had developed a new type of saddle for the dragons that was more comfortable for both the dragons and their riders. She had also created a communication system that allowed dragon riders to stay in contact with each other, even when separated by large distances. These innovations had been developed through collaboration with elven craftspeople who understood dragon anatomy and behavior in ways that humans could never learn. As the sun began to set over Harmony's Rest, Lyra received a message requesting that she come to the central plaza. A celebration was being organized, something that happened regularly in the settlement now. Both humans and elves believed in marking important occasions together, and tonight they were celebrating the anniversary of the first integrated community. The plaza filled with hundreds of people as evening approached. Long tables had been set up with food that combined human and elven cuisines. Musicians from both species were preparing to perform. Children of both races played together at the edges of the gathering, their laughter seeming to echo across the valley. King Aldrich had come for the celebration, along with the highest human command authority on Calthera, a general named James Thompson who had become a close collaborator of King Aldrich. The two leaders stood together watching the gathering, and their body language suggested genuine friendship and respect. Rivera and Thorn were also present, standing together in a way that suggested they had become true partners, rather than representatives of opposing military forces. When the celebration truly began, King Aldrich asked for quiet. He wanted to make a formal statement. He stood before the gathered crowd of humans and elves and spoke about the transformation that had occurred over this single year. He acknowledged the fears that had existed on both sides before Lyra had taken her brave first step toward understanding. He recognized the sacrifices that people from both species had made to build something new and beautiful. Then the king did something unexpected. He asked Lyra to step forward. She found herself at the center of attention as King Aldrich spoke about her role in all of this. He described her as a bridge between worlds, a person whose courage and faith in the best of both peoples had made everything possible. He declared that she should be honored by both the Elven Kingdom and the human government as an ambassador of peace. A human ceremony followed, with General Thompson presenting Lyra with a Medal of Honor. Then an elven ceremony took place, with King Aldrich giving her a pendant that was made of rare Caltheran crystal, something that had been crafted by the finest artisans of both species working together. Lyra felt overwhelmed by the recognition, though she tried to accept it with grace. She looked at Storm and Ember and knew that they had been part of this journey too. The dragons had been steady companions throughout everything, representing the connection between humans and elves in ways that words sometimes could not express. Later that night, as the celebration continued and people danced and ate and shared stories, Lyra found herself walking away from the crowds with Storm. Ember flew alongside them as they made their way to a quiet place overlooking the valley. The stars were coming out now and they spread across the sky like diamonds on dark cloth. Storm pressed his head against Lyra's shoulder, and she felt through their bond the sense of satisfaction and peace that the dragon carried. Through the years they had been bonded, Lyra had learned to understand Storm's moods and thoughts. Tonight he seemed to be reflecting on how far they had all come together. Lyra thought about her grandmother, Elder Mira, who had called her foolish for studying human broadcasts. She thought about the council members who had doubted whether peace was possible. She thought about every moment of fear and uncertainty that had come before this night of celebration and unity. Most of all, she thought about the future. There would be challenges ahead. The integrated communities would face difficulties as humans and elves learned to truly live together. There would be misunderstandings and conflicts that needed to be worked through. The creatures from the outer wastes might become more dangerous before they became less dangerous. But none of these challenges seemed insurmountable anymore. 100 years from now, Lyra thought, children would be born who had both human and elven heritage. Languages might merge and adapt as the two peoples continued to interact. Technologies from both species would blend together and create new things that neither could have created alone. Calthera would become a world where two species thrived together, stronger for their unity. As she stood on the edge of Harmony's Rest with her dragons beside her and the future spreading out before her like that star-filled sky, Lyra finally allowed herself to fully believe that her dream had come true. Peace was not just possible. Peace was real, and it had been built by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, by those brave enough to believe in the best of each other, and by two dragons who had stood beside a young elf woman and helped her change the destiny of their world.